If you don't like living with us, you can leave. That's what my sister told me, standing in the middle of my own living room, with her arms folded across her chest like she owned the place. She said it casually, like she wasn't staring me down from the couch I had bought, in the house I had worked years to afford, while her and her husband lounged there rent-free, bills unpaid, groceries disappearing faster than I could replace them. The worst part? She said it with a smirk. A smirk that told me she believed every word, that she thought she had the upper hand, that somehow I was the intruder in my own home. My stomach twisted when I heard it, because in that moment I realized something I had been ignoring for far too long. The people I had bent over backward to help, the people I thought would be grateful, were the very ones trying to push me out of my own life. And trust me, once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I never planned to become the family safety net, but somehow, little by little, that's exactly what happened. My sister, Angela, had always been the type to land on her feet. At least that's what she wanted people to believe. In reality, every fresh start she and her husband, Rick, claimed they were pursuing ended with them broke, jobless, and looking for a couch to crash on. I had always been the responsible one, the one who kept a steady job, paid bills on time, saved for the future. So when Angela called me crying one late night, saying their landlord had locked them out and they had nowhere to go, of course I opened my door. I told myself it would be temporary, just a month or two until they got back on their feet. That was nearly a year ago. At first, I tried to keep boundaries. I asked them to contribute a little for groceries or utilities, but every time it turned into an excuse or a guilt trip. "We're just trying to get stable," Angela would say, looking at me like I was cold-hearted for even asking. "Rick's job prospects are picking up," she insisted, though most mornings I saw him still sleeping in while I rushed out the door for work. The weeks blurred into months. My fridge emptied faster, my bills crept higher, and my once peaceful home began to feel like a stranger's space. I would come back after a long day to find the living room trashed, dishes piled up, music blaring, and both of them sprawled across my couch like royalty. I started to feel like a guest in my own house, tiptoeing around to avoid confrontation, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight. But inside, the resentment grew. Each passive-aggressive comment, each dirty dish left in the sink, each package arriving at the door with Angela's name on it while she claimed she was too broke to buy groceries. It was like a drip of poison filling me up. And the day she told me in my own home that I could leave if I didn't like living with them, that was the moment the poison tipped over into something else. It wasn't just resentment anymore. It was a spark of cold clarity that told me something had to change. Because if I didn't take control, I wasn't just going to lose my peace. I was going to lose myself. I replayed her words in my head like a broken record, each time with more disbelief than the last. "If you don't like living with us, you can leave. My house. My mortgage. My furniture. My sweat and late nights that made those four walls possible." And somehow she had twisted the situation so far that she believed she had the authority to tell me to leave. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, listening to their laughter drifting down the hallway, the sound of a TV show they streamed with my Wi-Fi, and I thought about how I had reached this point. Growing up, Angela was the golden child. She was beautiful, charming, the kind of person who could get away with anything just by tilting her head and smiling. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the dependable one, the one our parents leaned on whenever Angela's impulsive decisions blew up in her face. And over the years, I fell into that role again and again, bailing her out after she dropped out of college the first time, helping her move when she quit her job on a whim in another state, covering her phone bill when she forgot to pay it. Each time I told myself it was just temporary, that I was being a good sister, that family helps family. But the truth was, Angela never really wanted to stand on her own 2 feet. She wanted someone else to carry her, and I had been foolish enough to play along. The difference now was that this wasn't a phone bill or a couch. It was my entire life. My sanctuary had become their playground. They never asked before inviting people over. They threw little gatherings that left beer bottles in my recycling bin and sticky stains on my counters. One Saturday, I came home to find a full-blown barbecue in my backyard. People I didn't even know lounging in my lawn chairs, smoke filling the air, Angela laughing like she was queen of the castle. When I asked why she hadn't mentioned it, she rolled her eyes. "Relax, you have plenty of space. Don't be so uptight." My name was on the deed, but hers was on the guest list. And the more I tried to assert myself, the more she acted like I was the intruder. The small, subtle digs grew sharper. "You're lucky we make this house feel alive. Rick and I are teaching you how to loosen up. Don't be so bitter all the time. It's not a good look on you." I would bite my tongue until it almost bled, because some part of me still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd wake up one day and realize how much they were taking advantage of me. But after her little declaration in my living room, that hope was gone. And with it, my patience. I started noticing the details I'd ignored before. The way my pantry shelves were half empty of snacks I never bought but Angela loved. The Amazon packages piling up by the door. Makeup, clothes, little gadgets, all charged to her card. But how did she have money for those things and not for rent? The endless excuses about job applications that never seemed to result in interviews. Rick's sudden back problems whenever I mentioned yard work or helping with chores. It all painted a picture I had been too blind or too kind to see clearly. They weren't planning to leave. Not in a month. Not in 6 months, not ever. They were settling in, rooting themselves into my home like weeds, draining the light and space until I barely recognized the life I'd built. And Angela knew it. That smirk on her face wasn't just arrogance, it was confidence. Confidence that I wouldn't do anything, because I never had before. But she was wrong. This time, she was dead wrong. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening, one of those nights when the exhaustion of the day already had me on edge. I walked through the door carrying 2 grocery bags that I had paid for, only to find Angela sitting at the counter sipping a glass of wine, scrolling on her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. Rick was sprawled on the couch, gaming headset glued to his ears, shouting at strangers online. I set the bags down, noticed the fridge door hanging open, and realized half of what I bought the previous weekend was already gone. When I asked Angela what happened to the groceries, she didn't even look up from her screen. "We had friends over and everyone got hungry. You wouldn't want us to be bad hosts, right?" My jaw nearly hit the floor. Hosts? It wasn't her food to serve, not her money funding these little feasts, but in her head, she was the generous one. I kept my voice calm, even though my pulse was pounding in my ears. "Angela, you've been here almost a year. I can't keep covering everything. You two need to start contributing." She gave me that pitying little laugh, the one she always used to make me feel small. "Contributing what?" "We're broke, remember? You know that. Besides, don't be so dramatic. You're single, you don't even have kids. What are you spending your money on anyway?" The audacity of it made me dizzy. In her mind, my stability was an open wallet for her chaos. And that was when I decided to start keeping track. Every bill, every grocery receipt, every delivery I had paid for. I built a folder, neat, organized, undeniable. Because one day soon, Angela and Rick were going to be faced with the truth, in black and white. But I didn't stop there. I started paying closer attention to what they were doing when they thought I wasn't watching. Angela bragged on the phone about reselling clothes online for extra cash. Rick, who claimed he couldn't find a steady job, always had new gaming equipment, and once I overheard him talking to a buddy about hitting a casino. They weren't broke. They were freeloading. And while they laughed in my living room, while they drained my fridge and trashed my peace, I was quietly gathering the kind of evidence that would leave them with nothing to say. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to let the truth speak louder than my anger ever could. And when I finally made my move, it would be one they never saw coming. It was around that time I noticed the mail. A thick white envelope addressed to Rick, tucked between my electricity bill and an ad for pizza delivery. I didn't usually snoop, but the return address caught my eye. It was from a bank. My curiosity won, and when Rick left it sitting on the counter for days, unopened, I finally glanced inside. It was a past due notice for a credit card, with charges stacked into the thousands. Designer sneakers, electronics, bar tabs. It was all there, a record of his recklessness. My stomach sank, but not with pity. With clarity. They weren't just careless. They were reckless parasites, digging themselves into debt while bleeding me dry in the process. That's when I knew my patience was not just kindness anymore, it was enabling, and I couldn't let it continue. From then on, I became meticulous. I locked my office door, kept a log of pantry items, even set small traps to see if they'd lie to my face. I'd leave $20 on the hall table, only to find it mysteriously missing by morning, followed by Angela's breezy excuses about needing gas. I documented everything. Screenshots of texts where she promised to pay me next week. Photos of receipts with my signature and their favorite brands tucked in the bags. Even recordings of arguments where Angela twisted everything back on me, painting herself the victim. I wasn't gathering this for myself. I already knew the truth. I was gathering it for what was coming. Meanwhile, their arrogance grew. One night, Angela had the nerve to stand in my kitchen with a glass of wine and say, "You know, this house really feels like ours now. Rick and I were just saying we'd be so lost without it. You're lucky to have us bringing it to life." I nearly choked. Lucky to have them tearing apart the home I built. To have my hard work funding their laziness? But I bit my tongue and smiled, because now I wasn't angry anymore, I was focused. And focus is far more dangerous than rage. The day they told me I should leave my own house was the day I started my plan. A plan that involved documentation, legal advice, and patience. Because when I finally struck back, I wasn't going to simply kick them out. I was going to make sure they could never manipulate me again, and that every bridge they tried to build on my back went up in flames behind them. I hired a lawyer. Not because I wanted a war, but because I wanted a record. An official line in the sand that said, "This is my house, and these are the facts." I sat across from a woman with a no-nonsense bob who smelled faintly of coffee and authority, and I slid my folder across the table. Receipts, photos, screenshots, dates, the past due notices, the text promises, the audio where Angela laughed about finding another couch while I begged her to contribute. "You don't need to do anything dramatic," she said, reading through it. "But you need to be deliberate. Eviction paperwork, a demand letter, forensic accounting if necessary, and change the locks." Change the locks? The idea felt small at first, almost petty, until I realized how powerful it was. For months, they'd treated my house like an open hotel, and the single act of closing the door behind me on my terms would announce that the rules had changed. I felt something like calm when I left the lawyer's office. It wasn't triumph. It was a cold, collected readiness. Over the next few weeks, I executed the plan with the precision of someone who had learned to binge patience into a weapon. I sent the demand letter first, a professional, unemotional list of amounts owed with exact dates and itemized purchases and a clear deadline. I didn't frame it as revenge. I framed it as accounting. $10,000 for groceries, utilities, missed income, and replaced items, itemized and totaled. When Angela opened that envelope, I watched her face like I was reading a verdict. She tried to laugh it off, told Rick it was a joke, that I was being dramatic. But the next day, I locked the spare key in my drawer and called the locksmith. I changed the locks on a Tuesday at noon while they were at a job interview that Rick never actually had. I left a polite notice on the door with the new entry instructions for guests and a reminder that anyone staying long-term needed to have a written agreement. That notice felt like a drumbeat in the house. The first 48 hours were chaos. They banged on my door. They accused me of betrayal, of being cold, of going nuclear. Angela cried in the driveway and waved receipts and friends' texts. "She's always been like this," they said. But I stood steady. I had prepared for the noise. I'd already set up a separate bank account and routed direct debits so that nothing of mine could be mistaken for a communal fund. I sent copies of the demand letter to the email addresses they used for deliveries and to the family chat so that everyone who mattered could see the ledger of their time here. I also did something they didn't expect. I offered them a way out that didn't require humiliation. A fair buyout plan for the things they'd taken. A reasonable deadline and a moving allowance if they left by a specific date. It wasn't mercy. It was leverage. People respond to a map more than a threat. The map shows the path forward, and I wanted them off my property and accountable, not camping in righteous martyrdom. Predictably, they tried to stall. Angela called me sobbing that Rick would never make it on his own if I did this, that I was ruining their chance at stability. She called our parents and spun a story about being betrayed for money. I answered every call with the same soft, even tone. I'm sorry you feel that way. The letter explains the steps. If you want to discuss repayment, let's talk with the lawyer. When the neighbors started picking sides, because neighbors always do, my inbox filled with petty alliances and whispers. I didn't engage. Instead, I documented. I photographed the state of the house before they packed anything. The couch cushions, the dented coffee table, the wine labels on the counter. I made a timeline of the months they'd been here, cross-referencing texts and receipts with dates. I forwarded copies to my lawyer and to the property management company for good measure. There was one night about 2 weeks into the process when Angela tried to manipulate the situation in front of friends, staging a sob story about mental health, and how could you do this to family? Rick shouted that the house was a public service for his recovering self. A couple of her friends blamed me for being heartless. I let them talk. Then I unplugged the living room speakers and removed the extra chargers from the outlets. I set a curfew for the washer and dryer and posted it on the fridge like a small, bureaucratic slap. The little changes created friction, tiny, precise cuts that turned comfort into inconvenience. They retaliated by staging a scene, a late-night party that left my hallway littered with cigarette butts and a broken lamp. I did not shout. I cleaned it up, photographed the damage, and sent the bill to their account with a gentle note. Please reimburse by Friday. When Friday came, there was silence. On Saturday morning, Angela's brother, who'd always been the family's unofficial mediator, knocked on my door with a false smile and a suggestion. Why don't we all just sit down and talk? No lawyers. I invited him in, made coffee, and led him to the kitchen table where my folder sat open. I walked him through the receipts, the dates, Rick's gambling texts, the reselling schemes Angela had quietly boasted about, the nights she'd posted mannequins of luxury purchases while claiming she had no cash for groceries. He shifted in his seat and asked questions, and for the first time one of their allies admitted, half-whispered, that maybe things had gone too far. But words mean nothing without action. So I gave him a choice: help them pack by the deadline, or I'd submit the ledger to small claims court and file for damages. He left without promising anything. On the legal side, I filed the eviction paperwork where it mattered and set a court date that would force them to appear. I also took a step that felt harsher than the locks. I froze any informal loans that I had previously extended. The credit card I'd once covered for Angela was moved to zero, the overdraft she'd used was closed, and any automatic transfers were rerouted. It was a surgical removal of the safety net. They complained that I'd left them stranded. I responded that I hadn't left them, only removed the source of their theft. The truth is, as the deadline approached, the cracks in their story grew. Rick's promised job offers evaporated. Angela's reselling profits weren't nearly enough to cover the debt, and several of her buyers were friends with returns to make. I watched as pride turned to panic and panic to desperation. They pawned small things, then bigger ones. Angela tried to guilt me with stories of childhood traumas and systemic unfairness. She called me a monster for making them go through this. I slept less, but with a clarity that felt holy. I was no longer the woman who opened her door because she felt obligated. I rebuilt boundaries the way carpenters rebuild a house, measured, level, and permanent. The morning they finally moved out, the driveway was a chaotic burst of boxes and shouted promises that they'd pay you back and that this was for the best. They left their trash behind like a parting insult. I called a hauling service, had it cleared, and before the truck left, I walked through the empty rooms and sat on the couch for the first time in months without someone else's sigh in my ear. I didn't dance or scream. I breathed. The bills were not all repaid. The court hearing had its own theater. Sobbing, accusations, half-truths, and a surprisingly detailed ledger from my side that made the judge nod and the opposing side fumble. They were ordered to reimburse a portion of what I'd documented. It wasn't everything, but it was accountability. In the months that followed, the house felt different not because it changed, but because I had. Smaller habits became rituals. Locking the door, replying to texts on my terms, saying no without recoil. Friends noticed that I was less apologetic in my laughter and more deliberate in my plans. Family dinners were awkward at first. My parents had to reconcile their idea of loyalty with the facts I'd presented. Some relatives never forgave me for making a scene, but others reached out with quiet apologies and offers to help in small, real ways. Revenge, I learned, was not the sudden collapse of someone else's life, but the steady reclaiming of your own. It was the ledger, the locks, the lawyer's quiet confidence, and the discipline to enforce boundary after boundary. It was also the way I refused to let their version of events become my identity. Angela texted me months later, after the judge's order had been partially enforced, begging for another chance, promising to change, promising to return what she could. I didn't respond immediately. When I did, it was a single sentence. I hope you find the life you promised yourself. I didn't gloat. I didn't humiliate. I closed the door with civility, and that felt like the sharpest cut of all, because where anger seeks punishment, boundaries protect the future. Angela underestimated the silence. She thought that once the shouting stopped, once the doors closed and the court date was behind us, I'd soften. That I'd let her trickle back into my life with late-night apologies, half-finished promises, and stories about how Rick is different now or we've turned a corner. But silence wasn't absence. It was strategy. I filled my time with rebuilding routines they had trampled. Saturday mornings, once lost to cleaning up their messes, became slow rituals of coffee on the porch, a book open in my lap, the sound of birds instead of Angela's voice echoing through my kitchen. I walked through my home like it was new, rearranging furniture, painting over scuff marks, reclaiming space they had tried to brand as theirs. And each time I picked up a brush or moved a chair, I felt the weight of them peel off me like old wallpaper. Of course, they didn't disappear. Parasites rarely do. They resurfaced in whispers at family gatherings, where cousins would mention how Angela and Rick were still struggling and maybe you should forgive and forget. My parents were torn. On one hand, they knew the evidence I'd presented was airtight, undeniable. On the other, Angela was their youngest, their fragile one, the one they'd always coddled. "She's still your sister," my mother would say softly over the phone, her voice heavy with guilt that wasn't mine to carry. Family should be there for each other. I learned to answer with precision. Family doesn't take the roof off your head and tell you to leave. The first few times I said it, my voice trembled with old anger. But repetition turned it into fact, unshakable and calm. Facts were my armor. I carried them like receipts in my pocket. Meanwhile, Angela's life started showing cracks bigger than the ones she'd left in my walls. A mutual friend told me Rick had bailed on her, vanishing with whatever scraps of money he could scrounge. Another whispered that Angela was hopping from couch to couch, spinning the same sob story she once used on me, but with less success each time. People were catching on. The charm she'd wielded so easily before was wearing thin under the weight of her own patterns. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. Her downfall was her own design. Still, the texts kept coming. At first, they were angry. "You ruined my life. I'll never forgive you. You've always been jealous." Then they shifted into guilt. "I'm your sister. How can you watch me suffer?" And finally, into desperation. "Just a little help. Just this once. I promise it'll be different." But I had already learned. Promises are empty without proof. And Angela had never once given me proof she could change. So I did what she never expected. I ignored her. No dramatic speeches, no emotional phone calls, no drawn-out explanations. Just silence. And that silence was louder than any argument we had ever had. It echoed into the spaces where she had once planted her chaos, and it reminded her that she no longer had power here. My revenge wasn't the eviction, the ledger, or even the judge's order. It was the life I built afterward. A life she couldn't access, couldn't drain, couldn't manipulate. I traveled for the first time in years, spent weekends with friends without worrying what state my house would be in when I returned. Bought myself small luxuries that once disappeared into feeding 3 mouths instead of 1. Freedom tasted like the first sip of cold water after a long, scorching day. Pure, clean, irreplaceable. And every time Angela tried to claw her way back, she ran into a wall she never believed I'd build. Me, unshakable, unmoved, and unwilling to ever open that door again. Months passed, and the rhythm of my life settled into something I hadn't realized I'd been craving for years: quiet stability. The kind of peace that doesn't announce itself but slips into the corners of your days, soft and steady, until you realize you haven't clenched your jaw in weeks. For the first time in so long, I wasn't cleaning up after anyone else's chaos. No strange voices filling my living room, no empty wine bottles clinking in the trash, no mysterious bills piling up on the counter. Just me, my routines, my choices. But Angela's shadow didn't vanish completely. It lingered in unexpected places. A cousin's birthday party where she arrived late, eyes darting, clothes mismatched. A mutual friend whispering that she'd been seen working odd jobs and couch hopping. A social media post where she painted herself the victim of a cold-hearted sister who had abandoned her. At first, the smear campaign stung. I'd scroll past her cryptic posts. Not everyone who smiles at you is your friend. Some people only love you when you're useful. And feel the old anger boiling up. But then, I noticed something else. The likes and comments dwindled. The same people who once rallied to her side with sympathy were quieter now, offering no public defense. It was as though the audience she depended on had grown weary of the performance. Without someone to bankroll her lifestyle or absorb her chaos, her stage was shrinking. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. I recognized Angela's handwriting instantly, big, looping, dramatic. My chest tightened, but I picked it up and opened it. Inside, she had written 4 messy pages, alternating between apologies and accusations. She admitted some things, said Rick had left her with debt, said she'd made mistakes, but every confession was followed by a justification. I only stayed so long because you made it too easy. I only spent that money because I thought you could afford it. I only said you should leave because I was angry. It was a letter designed not to take responsibility, but to pry open a door I had firmly closed. When I finished reading, I folded it neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into a drawer. I didn't rip it up. I didn't respond. I let it sit there as a reminder, not of her, but of me, the woman who had finally learned the difference between helping and being used. That silence again became my sharpest weapon, because while she spiraled in her cycles of self-destruction, I built something unshakable. I took up new hobbies, gardening, cooking recipes I never had time for before. I reconnected with friends I had neglected while my house was overrun. I even began dating again, cautiously, realizing that I deserved companionship built on respect, not obligation. And as each layer of my life grew stronger, Angela's presence felt smaller, like a faded stain that no longer dominated the room. My revenge was never the eviction itself, though that was the catalyst. My revenge was the life she could no longer touch, the laughter she wasn't invited to, the peace she couldn't destroy, the security she could never take credit for. She had wanted me to believe I couldn't survive without her chaos, but the truth was the opposite. Without her, I thrived. And every day I woke up in my quiet, orderly home, every time I turned the key in the lock that only I held, I knew that was the one victory she would never be able to undo. The court's reimbursement order finally began trickling in, small payments that arrived like reluctant apologies. Angela didn't send them directly, of course. They came through garnished wages from a part-time retail job she'd picked up. Every deposit into my account was both laughable and satisfying, not because the money covered the damage, but because it was proof written into the system, that she could no longer wriggle away from accountability. She used to mock me for being too uptight about paperwork, for keeping receipts and spreadsheets. Now those same habits had turned into shackles she couldn't slip out of. Meanwhile, family gatherings became their own theater. Angela showed up less and less, and when she did, the room seemed to hold its breath. Gone was the glossy confidence, the perfectly rehearsed charm. She carried herself smaller now, her excuses thinner, her smiles tighter. Our relatives didn't say much aloud, but I caught the sideways glances, the quiet shifts in sympathy. For years, I'd been the one cast as the rigid, unforgiving sister, the one who didn't know how to loosen up. But now, in the wake of everything, people saw the truth. They saw her patterns. They saw my steadiness. And slowly their judgment turned into respect. One uncle even pulled me aside at Thanksgiving, lowered his voice, and said, "You did the right thing. Should have been done a long time ago." That small acknowledgement felt heavier than gold. Angela tried one last dramatic stunt that winter. She arrived at my doorstep unannounced, shivering, coat too thin for the biting wind. For a brief second, old instincts tugged at me, the ones that had once rushed to open doors, to patch her wounds, to take her in no matter the cost. But then I remembered the months of chaos, the smirk in my living room, the letter in the drawer full of excuses. I stood in the doorway blocking the entrance and asked simply, "What do you need?" Her eyes darted, her mouth opened and closed, searching for the right combination of guilt and desperation. Finally, she said, "Just a place to stay for a few nights. I'll figure it out after." The words were identical to the ones she'd spoken a year before, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that nothing had changed. I shook my head. "I hope you find somewhere safe, but it won't be here." I closed the door gently, not slammed, not dramatic, just final. Behind it, I heard her footsteps retreat, swallowed by the night. I leaned against the wood, heart steady, not racing. For the first time, I didn't feel fear or guilt. I felt free. That was the moment I realized revenge isn't always about dramatic takedowns or explosive confrontations. Sometimes it's about the quiet power of saying no, of holding the line, of refusing to let someone rewrite the story you've already survived. Angela had taken my peace once. She would never take it again. Spring arrived, and with it, a clarity that felt like a second skin. My garden bloomed in colors I hadn't noticed the year before. Lavender by the fence, roses opening slow and steady by the porch. I spent mornings sipping coffee with the windows open, listening to birds instead of Angela's arguments. Every corner of my home whispered back to me now, reminding me it was mine, truly mine, untouched by freeloaders who once tried to claim it. Word drifted through the grapevine that Angela had burned through most of her bridges. Friends who once took her in learned the same lesson I had, though faster. One kicked her out after finding empty bottles hidden under the couch. Another told me privately that she had borrowed money and never paid it back. Each story was a mirror, reflecting back the pattern I had lived with for too long. Except now, instead of guilt, I felt distance. Her chaos was no longer my responsibility. It was a storm I could observe from afar without getting wet. The garnishments continued, small deposits arriving with bureaucratic consistency. I didn't need the money anymore, not really. But every line on my bank statement felt like a receipt stamped by the universe, proof that accountability had finally caught her. Family still tried in their way to mend the rift. My mother called one afternoon, her voice fragile. "She's struggling. Maybe you could just talk to her, hear her out." I answered with the same calm certainty I'd carried into court. I did talk to her, for years. Talking doesn't change people who don't want to change. Silence hung between us, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was acceptance. Over time, relatives stopped pushing me to reconcile. They saw the strength in my boundaries, the peace I had carved out of the wreckage, and they stopped trying to pry the door back open. One evening, while clearing out old boxes, I found a photograph of Angela and me as kids, standing side by side, smiling with ice cream cones in our hands. For a moment, grief hit me like a wave, not for the sister I had, but for the sister I had wished she could be. But grief passed. and what remained was gratitude. Gratitude that I had finally broken the cycle, that I had chosen myself before I drowned in her patterns. And that became the final act of my revenge. Not her downfall, not her shame, not even the repayments. It was the life I reclaimed, the joy I allowed back in, the peace I guarded fiercely. Every sunrise over my quiet house, every laugh with friends uninterrupted by her shadow, every locked door that clicked shut behind me, I savored it all like a victory. And maybe Angela will spend the rest of her life chasing couches and excuses. Maybe she'll never change. But me, I changed everything. And that is the one thing she can never take back. Summer rolled in with long, golden evenings, and I found myself hosting friends in the backyard, the same backyard Angela once filled with strangers and chaos. But this time it was different. We grilled vegetables, played quiet music, and laughed until the stars came out. When people left, the yard was clean, the laughter still hanging in the air like a soft echo, and I realized how much I had missed this kind of life. One that didn't leave me anxious, one that didn't drain me. The house no longer felt haunted by their presence. It was mine again, fully alive but only on my terms. And yet Angela still tried to creep back in. A cousin forwarded me screenshots of her online rants, accusing me of betrayal, of being selfish, of turning my back on family. At first those words stung. Then I noticed who was commenting. Nobody. The posts sat there desperate and echoing with no audience. The curtain had dropped on her performance, and she was left shouting into an empty room. For a woman who thrived on attention, that was the harshest consequence of all. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself, didn't even acknowledge it. My silence was the one thing she couldn't twist, and that silence carried more weight than 1,000 arguments ever could. One evening, months later, I got another letter from her. Shorter this time, barely a page. She wrote about missing me, about wanting a real sister again, but it was lined with the same excuses and blame. I read it once, folded it, and slipped it into the same drawer as the first one. That drawer became a kind of vault, not of pain, but of proof. Proof that I had chosen differently, proof that I would never go back. Instead of answering, I spent the next day repainting my living room. Soft cream walls, sunlight bouncing off them, making the space glow. As I worked, I thought about all the hours I had once spent cleaning up after her, pouring myself into a black hole of ungratefulness. And now, every brushstroke felt like sealing that hole forever. Friends noticed the change in me. They said I carried myself lighter, that I laughed easier, that I didn't second-guess myself the way I used to. And they were right. The woman I had been, the one who opened her doors, her wallet, her sanity for people who didn't respect her, was gone. In her place was someone firmer, steadier, someone who knew that boundaries weren't walls but gates, and not everyone earned the right to walk through them. That was the greatest revenge I could have ever taken, not screaming, not proving a point, but thriving in a life free of the people who thought they could smother me. Angela lost access to me, and losing me, the sister who once gave everything, was the one loss she could never replace. Autumn came, and with it a crispness in the air that felt like closure. The leaves turned gold and red, drifting across my lawn in quiet waves, and I realized how different everything looked without the weight of constant chaos pressing down on me. My house, once a battlefield of resentment and entitlement, now felt like a sanctuary again. I spent my evenings in the glow of warm lamps, cooking meals for myself, enjoying the sound of silence that was once filled with arguments and laughter that never belonged to me. I had thought for so long that family meant unconditional sacrifice, that love meant swallowing my boundaries until there was nothing left of me. But now I understood the truth. Family, real family, doesn't make you feel like a stranger in your own home. It doesn't drain you until you're empty. It doesn't tell you to leave what you built with your own hands. Real family respects, protects, and gives back. Angela never learned that, and maybe she never will. Her story continued on the periphery. Rumors of new couches, new hosts, new cycles repeating like a scratched record. But for me, it was no longer my problem. My revenge wasn't dramatic fireworks or shouting matches. It was this: a life reclaimed, peace restored, boundaries set in stone. It was the quiet mornings when I unlocked the door and felt safe, the evenings when I invited only the people I chose into my home, the knowledge that I had finally broken a pattern generations deep. I don't look for Angela in crowds anymore. I don't check my phone waiting for her to change. I simply live, and living fully, freely, and without her shadow. That is the sweetest revenge of all. So tell me, if it had been you in my place, would you have done the same? Or would you have given your sister another chance?